Alright, what's on the docket for today? Oh, it's Thomas and the Magic Railroad. I don't really know anything about Thomas, so I don't really know how to make it work. I mean, I know the general premise of the movie and, the aftermath and how it destroyed the franchise, but I don't think I'm the best one to talk about it. I know somebody else. Come on, Kyle, I need your help.
What do you think of when you hear Thomas the Tank Engine? If you're a normal person, it might be something like, that's that weird old British baby show with the talking trains whose faces don't move that for some reason a bunch of adults seem to really like. If you are one of those adults, you might be chomping at the bit to correct me and say, Thomas isn't a train, he's an LBSC Class E2 tank engine with extended side tanks. A train is what he pulls. Well, that's true, but it begs the pertinent question, who cares? Or maybe, why would anyone care? It's just some little preschool show, right? Well, you wouldn't be wrong to ask that. Especially if you've caught wind of Thomas's most recent trip to the workshops and subsequent redesign. Even before this reboot, though, Thomas was already becoming more and more of a stock standard toddler show with each new retooling. Well, almost every retooling, but that's not what we're here to talk about. So, if this franchise has been going downhill faster than a runaway line of troublesome trucks, why are so many people so invested in it? Well, things weren't always this way. Let's rewind a few years. 76 years, to be exact. If you don't know the story, in May 1945, a little book called The Three Railway Engines was published by a clergyman named Wilbur Awdry. It featured 4 short stories following the personified steam engines on the fictitious island of Sodor. The following year came the Reverend Awdry's second book in his Railway series, Thomas the Tank Engine, introducing the #1 blue tank engine we know today. The stories were fairly simple, little more than bedtime stories. In fact, that's what the original stories were before they were ever put to paper. But as the series continued, the Reverend wrote more and more complexity into his stories. The Railway series became basically completely realistic. Minus, of course, the personification of railway engines. We got to see the fictitious railway the engines worked on as it dealt with what was actually happening in the real world. Not one to do things halfway, Awdry didn't just write stories about Sodor. He created Sodor. There's more than one book published with nothing but the history of this non-existent British island. For all intents and purposes, Sodor became real. The Railway series stood out to children, parents, and actual railway workers alike as something special. And it also stood out to one Britt Allcroft. If you grew up watching Thomas and Friends, you might remember this name showing up at the start of all your old VHS tapes. She's going to be a pretty important figure in the rise and fall of Thomas. Maybe more than Awdry himself. From the 1950s to the 1970s, there were a handful of attempts to televise the Railway series in a variety of mediums. None of them really took off. But things would change forever in 1979, when Wilbur Awdry and Britt Allcroft first met. Allcroft was working as a producer on a special feature on steam engines, and Awdry was interviewed for it. Allcroft became deeply invested by the Reverend and his books. She recognized the unique charm that Sodor had, the detail and realism of the railway juxtaposed with the charm and magic of the smiling steam trains on their special little island. She knew how much potential it had, and when Awdry finally agreed to let her adapt his books, she went all out. Partnering up with director David Mitton, composers Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell, and the Beatles' very own Ringo Starr as the show's narrator, the pieces came together, and in 1984, Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends was born. Eventually, it would just be shortened to Thomas and Friends. For 2 seasons, the show went on to receive widespread success in the UK, and eventually the USA, Japan, and all over. The Railway series was already popular, but Thomas and Friends was a phenomenon. And as Awdry put it, this made Allcroft and her team big-headed, as he put it. In the 3rd season, which began in 1991, the Britt Allcroft Company started producing their own original episodes. Out of the 26 episodes, only half of them were still based on Awdry's stories. 2 were written completely original by Allcroft and Mitton, and the remaining 11 were actually adapted from magazine stories written after the success of the first 2 seasons, by a man named Andrew Brenner, who also has a very interesting role to play in Thomas's legacy, though he's not going to play quite as big a part in the conversation today. We'll touch on him later. After the 3rd season, we got one more season of Railway series adaptations, and then things took a big change, and we started to see what Allcroft's real vision of what Thomas should be. And it was, in a word, different. The 5th season of Thomas and Friends aired in 1998, the year after Audrey's passing, and from the get-go there was a change. Every story was completely original. There were new characters who had never been seen in the books. Some became mainstays of the series, like Cranky the Crane. Everything about the season was different from the 4 seasons before, but not in a bad way. Season 5 is an absolute fan favorite, and for good reason. The visuals were still incredibly detailed and immersive, thanks to the talents of David Mitton. The characters were all engaging and had great dynamics, and the original stories were all great on the whole. The show got very experimental with its effects and action. Watch episodes like Rusty and the Boulder, Put Upon Percy, or Toby and the Flood, and you'll see just how much fun the crew was having behind the scenes with their new creative freedom. But as great of a spectacle as this season was, it was the beginning of the building up to Thomas's downfall. There was a reason Britt Allcroft made the decision to start making original stories, even while there were about 15 or so books by both Wilbur Awdry and his son Christopher, who continued the series after his father's retirement, that hadn't even been touched yet. It was all part of Britt's vision. She wanted Thomas to be even bigger than he already was. She wanted a movie. And to prove that she could make a cinematic Thomas experience, she had to show the world that her Thomas had his own identity apart from the Railway series. As early as 1994, she'd been planning a feature-length Thomas film, and as such, the book adaptations would have to end after the 4th season in 1995. And so, after all that setup, we finally come to the main event. Thomas and the Magic Railroad. If Season 5 of Thomas and Friends took a different approach from the seasons before it, then Magic Railroad was a different universe. And I mean that literally. Allcroft had a very different vision for Thomas than Awdry did, and that is never clearer than it is in this movie. Awdry was a bit of a stickler for his realism. He didn't even like it when a train would break a railway regulation in one of the original episodes. So you could probably imagine that something with Magic Railroad in its title was pretty drastically different from the world he had created. So what's the movie about? Well, it has a bit of a quirk. You might look at the title and naturally assume the movie is all about Thomas and his first big cinematic adventure. But weirdly enough, nope. Instead of following Thomas or any of the Sodor engines, we follow an ensemble of human characters consisting of Burnett Stone, his granddaughter Lily, and Mr. Conductor of Shining Time Station, trying to find the magical lost engine to save the Conductor's magical universe from destruction at the evil hands of P.T. Boomer. Does this all sound a little strange to you? Be a little distant from the industrial railway stories that Britt Allcroft had spent the last decade and a half creating, and Wilbur Awdry even longer before that? Are you wondering what the heck Shining Time Station even is? Well, congratulations on being just as in the dark as fans of the series in the UK, or people who watched all the episodes through home media releases. You see, when Allcroft bought Thomas over to the USA, she found out that the 4.5-minute episodes were way too short for American television airings. So she invented a framing device, Shining Time Station. This was a live-action show starring Ringo Starr, and later George Carlin, the American narrator for the series, as the 10-inch tall Mr. Conductor, who worked at a little station called Shining Time. In each episode, the story would take a break to hear Mr. Conductor tell a story about the island of Sodor, which allowed Allcroft to integrate Thomas and Friends into the US broadcasts. The thing is, this wasn't a thing in the UK, and it wasn't included in any of the Thomas VHS releases, which meant when Magic Railroad crossed over Thomas and Shining Time, there was a whole audience that was left completely confused. Meanwhile, David Mitton's attempts at crossing his own personal show over with Thomas, about talking tugboats, aptly named Tugs, was completely shut down by Allcroft. She had her own vision for this movie, and she was sticking to it no matter what. Or, at least, that was the plan. The troubled production of Magic Railroad could be a movie all on its own. First, Allcroft wanted to to partner with Barry Lyndon of Paramount Pictures to fund the movie in 1996. But then Lyndon left the company, and Paramount was no longer interested in producing it. Then she turned to Polygram Video, but they didn't really want to produce it either. It was only in 1999 when Barry Lyndon came back on the scene as chairman of Destination Films, owned by Sony. And finally, Alcroft had funding. But it wasn't all smooth sailing after that. The model engines had to be shipped from England to the new filming location in Toronto. Several new props had to be built from scratch. Some were damaged during filming. And while the production crew were filming with the props in Toronto, the live-action portions had to be filmed in Pennsylvania, and the Isle of Man in the British Isles. The making of the movie was a difficult process on its own. But then, the test audiences came in, and everything changed. Literally, everything. The test audiences hated it. A lot of the voice actors had to be replaced for sounding too scary or too old to play certain characters. And if that wasn't enough, remember that P.T. Boomer guy I mentioned? The big bad of the movie? Well, it turns out he was too scary too, and he had to be cut completely. His role was usurped by the secondary villain of the movie, a large, menacing diesel engine called Diesel 10. The movie had to be almost completely remade. Scenes were cut, the entire framing device and narrator of the film were changed, whole characters and story arcs were removed altogether. The original script and some deleted scenes have since been released, but the official finished project was ultimately very incomplete, as both a film and an addition to the Thomas universe. And it didn't take long for critics and audiences to pick up on that. Everything about the film was torn apart, from the special effects to the confusing and disjointed narrative thanks to all the cuts. And the diehard fans of the books were the biggest detractors. This might have been Alcroft's perfect vision of Thomas, but it seemed like the general population didn't quite agree. Audrey had passed away by now, but the amount of people who still to this day will say what a crucial misunderstanding this movie is of what the island of Sodor represents tells the whole story. Britt's vision had failed, not only with its audiences, but financially too. Magic Railroad was a box office flop, with a $19 million budget and only $19.7 million coming back, barely breaking even. This was a big problem going forwards into the new millennium of Thomas's life. This show was not cheap to produce. Building new model trains every year, repairing old ones, and successfully producing stories cost a pretty penny. And unfortunately for the Britt Allcroft Company, or Ghislaine Entertainment as it was now called, they didn't have the money to keep the show going after the waste that was Magic Railroad. After producing one more season of the TV series, Ghislaine was bought out by British American children's television company, Hit Entertainment. After the 7th season of the show came out in 2003, Hit Entertainment decided to take the show in a new direction. A direction that Britt Allcroft was no longer a part of. Season 8 saw a soft reboot of the franchise, focusing it more on education and life lessons. The world was simplified for an even younger audience than the books or the original seasons. There was new music, a new narrator in the US, and a much more juvenile tone. This new version of the show would continue until 2009, when Hit made another big change. Filming the show with model props was too expensive to keep being practical, not to mention a rather old-fashioned aesthetic in the modern day. And so it was decided that the show would turn to CGI. With this change came an even more simplified and watered-down storytelling style, as the target demographic got younger and younger. It seemed like Thomas had finally met his doom after half a century since Audrey first started writing. But then, someone came back to the scene. In 2012, Hit Entertainment was bought out by American toy company Mattel, and a new head writer was appointed to the series, Andrew Brenner. I told you he'd come back into play. And as it turned out, having someone who used to write magazine stories for the series, ones that actually got turned into episodes no less, as your head writer was actually a pretty good idea, because things finally turned around. The show finally started to return to its roots and recreate the feeling of what the show once was. The dialogue was natural, clever, and character-driven, and the stories felt much more inspired. Things weren't perfect, but it was clear an effort was being made to return the show to its former glory. But the Renaissance wouldn't last forever. It was only a few years before poor marketing decisions by Mattel started to have an effect on the brand's income. And so began the vicious cycle of Mattel cutting corners on merchandise and the show's production to save money, only to result in a lower quality product, resulting in less money, resulting in more quality cuts. And with these cuts came new directions in the writing. Very corporate mandate decisions. We won't spend too much time going over every bad decision Mattel has made in the past 5 years or so. There's a lot. And ultimately, that's not what we're here to talk about. But we'll just cut to where we are now. Yeah. The mighty have certainly fallen. So, let's backtrack a little, no pun intended. What was Thomas and the Magic Railroad's role in all of this? Did Allcroft's passion project really lead to Thomas's doom? Well, if we're looking purely from the perspective that it was thanks to that film that the show was bought by Hit Entertainment, rebranded, rebooted, rinse, repeat until now, then yeah, absolutely. But was that the only thing? Andrew Brenner and his writing team during the period from 2013 to 2016 seemingly proved that it was possible for this show to be good again, if only to fall on its face soon after. But for as good as it was, things were never quite the same. Magic Railroad had done a damage on Thomas far greater than dooming Ghislaine to bankruptcy. The show may have been hurt, but Thomas's reputation took the biggest blow. For the first 5 seasons, not to mention the duration of the Railway series, the island of Sodor was not just some little fairy tale island with talking choo-choo trains for preschoolers. It was a place. A place with history. A past, present, and future. A place that embodied the nostalgia of a bygone era and the intricate power of steam engines. A place that, with just a little imagination, could be real. That was the true magic of Sodor. Not some magical sparkling gold dust or whatever else Magic Railroad's production team was inhaling when they were writing that thing. When the world saw Thomas traveling down that rainbow railroad, he ceased to be a steam engine. He became a product. And that's all he's been ever since. Even in the best years of the show since then, the priority has always been to market a brand. And ultimately, that disordered priority dragged Thomas further and further off the tracks until today. And it all started even before Magic Railroad. Yes, that's right, before. Magic Railroad is ultimately emblematic of the culmination of Britt Allcroft's mindset from the very beginning. From day one, she went into Thomas with the goal of making him as big of a phenomenon as he could be. And within the first 5 years, the franchise's creator would already be displeased with the direction things were going. And at that point, the biggest offenses were trees that were a little too close to the tracks. And Thomas showed up in more episodes than he was supposed to. But it was all about popularity. Maybe Wilbur Audrey was right. Maybe Allcroft was big-headed. Maybe Thomas and Friends was always a marketing tool, doomed to its fate from day one, almost 40 years ago. But then again, maybe it's not impossible for corporate ambition and genuine passion to coexist. Thomas and the Magic Railroad was an absolute disaster. Even the original script was still a convoluted, fantastical, magical mess that missed the mark of what Sodor was all about. But it was a disaster born from a vision. Britt Allcroft may have wanted to make Thomas a big thing at the expense of the Reverend's desire for perfection in the details of his railway practice. But she also wanted Thomas to be something special, just like he did. I can't look at this 2D, bouncy, stretchy cartoon train show and say it's something special, or born from a vision. Opinions be darned, it is what it is. A cheap effort by Mattel to turn Thomas into the lowest common denominator preschool show with bouncy high-energy shenanigans and nothing to tie it to its roots. That's not even to say there aren't people who are passionate about what they're doing and working on it with the best of their ability to make it something good. But ultimately, it's a product. Magic Railroad is a product too, but it's also art. Art born from someone's genuine vision for a franchise that was truly special to them and its audience. Mind you, not all art is good, and Thomas and the Magic Railroad was far from good. But at the end of the day, it really was something special. So in that regard, Britt Allcroft succeeded after all, even if it wasn't in the way she, or really anyone else ever, wanted. But for everything that went wrong, she still gave the world a true blue sensation. And that is something that is absolutely magical.
We would like to greatly thank Kyle for providing not only his research but also the vocal recordings for this specific video topic. We wouldn't have made this without him. Let's just thank the Patreon producers, Reziel, Leaf Razor, Sophie Burgers, Azarius, and Tanner Kapishki. If you would like your name read at the end of every video of ours, then please consider donating to the Patreon. There's a link down below. And, have a good day.